As the kids say, Moonbeam ice cream, Welsh seafarer with a dream? I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. The highlands of eastern Tennessee are an eerie place, one which I've actually had people asking me for years, what about eastern Tennessee? Every time I make a video, I remember those days on the TikTok. Anyway, sparsely inhabited and densely forested, the mist-filled valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains are home to stories of wild men, unsolved disappearances, and even paranormal encounters. Now, most of those stories are little more than folktales and modern myths propagated online, but within many of them are kernels of truth, and one of the more enigmatic tales predates white settlement in the region entirely. Long before the Scottish, Irish, and Welsh settled in America's oldest mountain range, they were within the domain of the large and powerful Cherokee Tribe. But even they hold memories of when they first came to the region, and of the people who came before them. According to Cherokee legend, those ancient hills were once the territory of a strange tribe they called the Moon-Eyed People, and who exactly they were is one of the great mysteries of American prehistory. In some tellings, they're wretched creatures who can't even see in the daylight. In others, they're related to the little people of Cherokee mythology, and others still, claiming to be directly from the mouth of a great Cherokee chief, describe them as potentially the most unexpected thing possible. Welshmen led by a legendary prince named Madoc ap Owen Gwynedd. Now, the through line between all versions, regardless of their source, is that at some point a great war was fought between these Moon-Eyed People and the Cherokee newcomers, a war which the Cherokee won. With that, the Moon-Eyed People faded from history, their story carried on by their conquerors, leaving us to wonder where they came from, if they'd survived, and, most importantly, were they Welsh? Speaking of survival, though, we have a pretty cool sponsor for this week's video: the book. Aside from having a design that makes it a glamorous addition to any bookshelf or coffee table, the book is a functioning how-to guide for just about everything you need to know in the event that things take a turn for the worse. With sections on topics like crafting a bow and arrows, water filtration, basic shelter construction, and much more, the book is a captivating and beautifully illustrated encyclopedia which offers not just the outline for rebuilding society, but also a glimpse through the innovative past of mankind. For me, when I saw the thing for the first time, it reminded me of classics like The Dangerous Book for Boys or The Daring Book for Girls, just with even more material. Now, I can't tell you that the book would have saved Madoc and his explorers, but I also can't tell you that it wouldn't have either, especially if they read the section on building a steam engine. With everything it entails, from the large size, the intricate diagrams created by professional scientists, historians, and architects, and specially engineered binding in paper, to the detailed information about science and history, it's no surprise that the book was a top project on Kickstarter and remains a bestseller today. It also makes a perfect gift, so whether you're buying for yourself or for your crew, we recommend clicking the link in the description and using code LORELODGE10 to get 10% off your order today. Especially if you're Welsh. Cymru am byth. Fort Mountain State Park in Georgia is one of the places most frequently associated with the Moon-Eyed People. According to a man with a doctorate in music, who for some reason presents himself as though he has a doctorate in history on his YouTube channel that I've decided shall remain nameless for reasons you may have already predicted, it was John Sevier himself who discovered the ancient complex. Described by the man I will refer to from here on as Dr. Music, as what appeared to him to be a vast military complex, sitting atop a mountain in Georgia and built with architectural engineering that was foreign to the natives. Stranger still, Dr. Music adds, it bore a striking resemblance to European constructed battlements. Consisting of a 12-foot wide stone wall that was 2 to 8 feet high, and the width suggested that it had once been much taller, it encircled nearly 100 acres at the top of the mountain that consisted of monster ferns fed by a spring that floated over 2 million gallons a day. And by the way, guys, if you're seeing the 3 little dots at the bottom right corner of the screen, that means I'm reading a quotation. I feel like for this video specifically, that is a very important message for you to receive. Anyway, though the structures themselves had long since collapsed, Dr. Music tells us that Sevier saw evidence of 2 towers, large gates, and 29 fortified fighting pits, at intervals of 50 or 60, in which a man might stand waist deep and wield a battle axe or any other weapons he might have handy. The solid fortress also may have served astronomical purposes, as Dr. Music notes that the northeast position of the wall even aligns perfectly with the summer solstice, meaning it's likely that they used it to predict the positions of the sun and the moon in the future, and using this knowledge to know when to plant their crops and when harvest might be late. But who could have built such a place? Sevier wanted to know, so he questioned the great chief Oconostado, 90 years old by this time, regarding who constructed it. The chief, Dr. Music says, told Sevier that when the Cherokee first arrived, they encountered a strange albino race, one which they learned had come across the Great Water. They were light-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed, and for some reason struggled to see in the daytime, apparently leading the American naturalist Benjamin Barton to speculate that due to their isolation, they initially sought shelter and hid in the cave systems of Appalachia, which after generations rendered them blind in the daylight. For this reason, the Cherokee called them the Moon-Eyed People, and it was they who built the fortress. I know you're probably noticing some issues, but let me just get through the rest of this and then we'll go over the mounting problems with the story, because it's gonna get worse. You see, despite their obvious physical handicap, the Moon-Eyed People became formidable foes of the Cherokee, and for long years they waged war on one another. Eventually, the Cherokee got the better of it, and they drove their enemy all the way to their last stronghold at the mouth of the Chickamauga. Probably pronounced that wrong, but wait till we get to the Welsh part, guys. Anyway, it was here that the Moon-Eyed People made their last stand, and they fought well enough to force a peace agreement which saw them leave the Appalachians, never to return. But where did the Moon-Eyed People come from, you ask? According to Dr. Music, one clue can be found located on the shores of one of America's busiest port cities, Mobile, Alabama. Citing the discovery of ancient Roman coins found in forts in Tennessee, and the similarities between such forts' defenses and the forts of Wales of the 9th and 10th century, the Daughters of the American Revolution figuratively planted the Welsh flag on the site in 1953, going so far as to commission and install a plaque in Mobile reading, "In memory of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer who landed on the shores of Mobile Bay and left behind, with the Indians, the Welsh language." And before anybody starts typing, I do have, this is precisely what I have a degree in. I'm not saying take my word for it, but there's a reason my attitude does not come from nowhere. Not to dwell on that, though. In 1170, Welsh explorer Prince Madoc and his 200 men discovered Mobile Bay over 300 years before Columbus did, Dr. Music states in entirely too matter-of-fact a manner. Madoc, he continues, was the illegitimate son of Owen Gwynedd, who was the Prince of North Wales. And yes, I was giving you the way he pronounced it because I'm trying to make a point. It's Owen Gwynedd. I mean, if you want to get really into the pronunciation, it's probably something more like Owain Gwynedd. But as the story goes, Madoc left Wales in the wake of his father's death in order to escape a bloody civil war which had broken out between his brothers, and Dr. Music explains that it's believed that he made 2 and perhaps even 3 voyages to America. As his version of events goes, Madoc was so impressed by this new land that he returned to Wales for more ships and colonists, where he recruited 12 ships worth of colonists before sailing into legend, never to be seen again. It would be hundreds of years later before the next known white people would arrive in America, our host continues, adding that one such explorer was Morgan Jones, who traveled inland to South Carolina, but he was captured and almost executed by a native tribe led by a light-skinned, blue-eyed chief who adorned traditional native garments. The Welshman pleaded for his life in his native tongue, and thus discovered that it was also the native's tongue. And when the chief recognized this, he spared Jones's life. Not only that, but in 1803, when Thomas Jefferson enacted the policy to remove all natives west of the Mississippi River, he recalled for the removal of what he termed Welsh Indians. And in 1804, Lewis and Clark wrote in their papers that they had met a strange tribe of Welsh Indians in southern Appalachia. Were these Welsh explorers the Moon-Eyed People who the Cherokees discovered living in Appalachia when the natives first arrived, Dr. Music asks? And was this mysterious stone ruin, which sat high atop Fort Mountain in Georgia, their last stand in the war against the Cherokees? As you have probably deduced, dear viewer, the answer is well, it's actually a lot more complicated than you might expect. There's a couple aspects of the narrative which don't make any logical sense off the bat, but at the same time, there may be something to the existence of the Moon-Eyed people and the legend of Prince Madoc's voyage. First things first, though, let's break down the problems with everything we just went through. For one, Benjamin Barton did not suggest that Madoc's colonists were the ancestors of the Moon-Eyed people. He suggested that the Moon-Eyed people were the ancestors of an albino tribe found in Panama by Welsh explorer Lionel Wafer in 1700. And though he did say that he'd heard the Moon-Eyed people couldn't see well in the daylight, he said absolutely nothing about caves turning anyone blind. He also just wouldn't have done that because it doesn't make sense. It would take generations of people not just taking shelter in caves, but literally never leaving them. Also, a tribe of people who are accustomed to cave dwelling have absolutely no need to build fortifications on top of a mountain. Caves are already a natural defense, especially if you're adapted to survive in them, and if you can't see during the daylight, they're a hell of a lot easier to defend than a mountaintop fortress. Also, I'll get to this in more detail in a minute, but Fort Mountain is not the earthworks that John Sevier found. It's in a completely different place. He was in North Carolina, Fort Mountain's in Georgia, and it's also not at the mouth of the Chickamauga. Like, even if we just go by the information Dr. Music gave us, he's telling us something that's inconsistent. Anyway, there's also a linguistic issue at play, since it's nearly impossible that someone speaking Welsh in the 18th century would be able to understand someone speaking Welsh from the 12th century, let alone after a millennium in isolation. For a visual aid on what the linguistic difference would be like, here is the 12th century Leomensbrut compared with the 17th century Hamlet. Now imagine if the guy who wrote the first one disappeared to America for 500 years. Think you'd be able to have a conversation with them? Probably not. I mean, just look at Scots and English. They're from the same island, yet I don't think I could read that without accidentally inventing a few new heresies. And that's English. Have you seen Welsh? Plus, historians like Gwyn Williams, who is a Welshman who speaks Welsh, have traced the Morgan Jones story to its origin and found it to be false and probably even a hoax. And where Dr. Music got the idea that Lewis and Clark wrote about encountering the Welsh Indians, I just have no clue. They didn't. They didn't write about that. In fact, they were sent to do precisely that. That was one of the objectives, and they didn't. They wrote that they didn't find them. Also, Lewis and Clark never went to the Southern Appalachians. As part of their expedition, they started from Kentucky. I need to be very clear here. The Lewis and Clark expedition, they started in Pittsburgh, went down the Ohio to the Mississippi, and then up the Missouri. They were never in Southern Appalachia. The rest of the story, however, isn't so easily dismissed, because John Sevier really did see some kind of ancient mound complex out there, and the Cherokee really did say that it had been built by a mysterious tribe of moon-eyed people. The Cherokee tell us that when they first arrived in the country which they inhabit, they found it possessed by certain moon-eyed people who could not see in the daytime. These wretches they expelled. This curious fact was communicated to me by Colonel Leonard Marbury, a very intelligent gentleman who has put me in possession of much important information concerning the Southern Indians. Possibly, the moon-eyed people driven away by the Cherokee were the ancestors of the albinos who inhabited the Isthmus of Darien, and of whom Lionel Wafer has given us an account. Be this as it may, it is certain that the albino variety of mankind is often continued for a very long time. Those words, penned by the American naturalist Benjamin Barton, constitute the first known written record to mention the so-called moon-eyed people. Published in 1797, Barton's New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America, an album coming from Fall Out Boy this summer, really doesn't say much else about the subject. The source, Colonel Leonard Marbury, was an officer in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, who after the war used his pension and land warrants to put down roots in the new U.S. state of Georgia. Under the authority of President Washington, he worked as something of a proto-Indian agent, acting as emissary to tribes such as the Creeks and the Cherokee on what was then the young nation's western frontier. He would be as good a source as any, but if he gave Barton anything more than the story, the latter never wrote it down. But as little as it was, Barton's writing, and probably a good amount of rumor coming out of the frontier, piqued the curiosity of at least a few historians and ethnographers over the years which followed. One of them was Ezekiel Sanford, who essentially copied the story into his History of the United States Before the Revolution, a new album coming from Fall Out Boy next summer, published in 1819. Sanford's version contains some slight edits, such as the addition that the Cherokee had migrated from the west, and the slight change from the moon-eyed people being expelled to being exterminated. John Haywood expanded on the story a few years later in The Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee, a new Fall Out Boy album coming 2 years from now, but after spending literally 3 hours trying to comprehend his atrocious writing style, I'm just going to jump ahead to how James Mooney summarized it in Myths of the Cherokee, because at least it makes grammatical sense. Haywood, he wrote, says that the invading Cherokee found white people near the head of the Little Tennessee, with forts extending thence down the Tennessee as far as Chickamauga Creek, with the locations of 3 forts actually given in the text. These people, the Cherokee reportedly believed, were responsible for the many mounds and petroglyphs found along the Tennessee Valley. And the newcomers took that personally. The Cherokee made war against them and drove them to the mouth of Big Chickamauga Creek, Mooney continued, where they entered into a treaty and agreed to remove if permitted to depart in peace. Permission being granted, they abandoned the country. Elsewhere, he speaks of this extirpated white race as having extended into Kentucky and probably also into western Tennessee, according to the concurrent traditions of different tribes. In addition, Haywood also described the homes of these people, though without giving any citation, as small circular structures of upright logs covered with earth which had been dug out from the inside. Mooney's writing is probably the most complete single academic work on the subject of the Moon-Eyed people, appropriate given his name, having been published in 1902. It's also the only one I've seen which references a named Cherokee source, which makes it especially useful. According to Mooney, he spoke with a man named Harry Smith, a half-Cherokee and father of the late chief of the East Cherokee, who told him that as a young boy he'd heard from the elders of his tribe that there was once a race of very small people, perfectly white, who once came and lived on the site of the ancient mound on the north of Hiawassee, at the mouth of Peachtree Creek, a few miles above the present Murphy, North Carolina. Though Smith didn't explain why, he did tell Mooney that these people afterward removed to the west. In addition to that account, Mooney also cited a Colonel Thomas, the white chief of the East Cherokee, who told him that he'd heard a legend of a similar people from a similar place who also went west. The two stories are plainly the same, Mooney wrote, although told independently and many miles apart. Now, the mound in question from Harry Smith's story was almost certainly the Peachtree Mound complex just east of Murphy, North Carolina. In 1941, an archaeological dig at that site, conducted by Frank Seltzer and Jesse Jennings, concluded that there was certainly evidence of habitation there, but somewhat confusingly, they seemed to have been fairly confident that it was by the Cherokee. The Cherokee themselves, on the other hand, appear to have been very confident that the mounds predated their arrival to the region, and that it, like all others in the area, had been built by the mysterious Moon-Eyed people they ultimately drove away. Frustratingly, Mooney appears to be the last person to actually mention the Moon-Eyed people in an academic context until the latter half of the 20th century. And when the subject finally did make its way back into academic thought, it wasn't about finding out who was there, but rather proving who wasn't. You see, when I started working on this episode, I expected there to be a lot more out there about the Moon-Eyed people. It's the kind of story that often has all sorts of conspiracy theory nonsense associated with it, like Tartaria, or the bizarre Frankenstein of various legends which make up most people's perceptions of things like skinwalkers and wendigos. But instead, I found that there are basically 3 versions of the Moon-Eyed people legend. There is the argument that they are a misunderstood reference to the little people of Cherokee folklore, the Yunwi Tsuntsi. I think I got that right, but I probably didn't. I'm trying my best here. If you're Cherokee, please tell me how to pronounce it. I'm being sincere with that. I know I sound a little off the cuff, but honestly, it helps. Anyway, there was also the suggestion that they're an entirely different race of half-blind monsters, like the crawlers from The Descent. That was my favorite, personally. And then there's the best-known one, that they are the descendants of the legendary Welsh prince Madoc ap Owen Gwynedd, who allegedly sailed to America in the 12th century. This view became very popular during the 19th century, and based on the limited number of documents mentioning the Moon-Eyed people, it's possible that Madoc's story is the only reason anyone outside the field of ethnography even knows about them. You see, though he doesn't use the term Moon-Eyed people, in 1810, U.S. Army Major Amos Stoddard wrote to former Tennessee Governor John Sevier to request a statement of particulars of a story which Governor Claiborne thinks you detailed to him some years ago. Stoddard continued, writing that, according to his account, you once saw an ancient book in the hands of a Cherokee woman, which you supposed was written in the Welsh characters, said to be given to her by an Indian from the west side of the Mississippi, and which was afterwards burned with her house. Stoddard then informed Sevier that he had been some time collecting material to prove the existence of a Welsh colony on this continent, which landed here, according to the testimony of history, as early as 1170. Sevier sent a lengthy reply, informing Stoddard that, with respect to the information you have requested, I shall, with pleasure, give you the information required, so far as my memory will now serve me, and with the help of a memorandum I hastily took on the subject of a nation of people called the Welsh Indians. Now, this was not a new subject of conversation at the time. Stories of the so-called Welsh Indians were well in circulation throughout the 18th century. And, as I said earlier, locating them had even been a side objective for the Lewis and Clark expedition several years earlier. As for why everyone was convinced that this was a thing, we'll get there. Anyway, as Sevier wrote, in the year 1782, I was on a campaign against the Cherokees, and during my route, discovered the traces of very ancient fortifications. Sometime after the expedition, I had occasion to enter into a negotiation with the Cherokee chiefs for the purpose of exchanging prisoners. After the exchange had been settled, I took an opportunity of inquiring of a venerable old chief named Oconostota, then and for nearly 60 years had been a ruling chief of the Cherokee Nation, if he could inform me of the people that had left such signs of fortifications in their country, and particularly the one on the bank of the Hiawassee River. This was, of course, the same river mentioned by Harry Smith and Colonel Thomas, who both told Mooney that they'd heard of a mound complex on that river from their own people. According to Sevier, Conestoga told him that it is handed down by our forefathers that the works were made by white people, who had formerly inhabited the country, while the Cherokees lived lower down in the country, now called South Carolina, and that a war existed between the two nations for many years. At length, it was discovered that the whites were making a number of large boats, which induced the Cherokees to suppose that they intended to descend the Tennessee River. They then collected their whole band of warriors and took the shortest and most convenient route to the Muscle Shoals in order to intercept them down the river. In a few days, the boats hove in sight and a warm combat ensued, with various success for several days. At length, the whites proposed to the Indians that if they would exchange prisoners and cease hostilities, they would leave the country and never more return, which was acceded to, and after the exchange, parted in friendship. The whites then descended the Tennessee to the Ohio, and then down to the Big River, the Missouri, then up that river a very great distance. They are now of some of its branches, but they are no longer a white people. They are now all become Indians, and look like the other red people of the country. To this point in the story, though the term moon-eyed people never once appears, every single detail is in line with what was recorded by the ethnographers, including that which came directly from members of the Cherokee people. Now, what Sevier said next is not. I then asked him, the letter continues, if he had ever heard any of his ancestors say what nation of people those white people belonged to. The Conestoga, if Sevier is to be believed, answered, I have heard my grandfather and other old people say that they were a people called Welsh, that they had crossed the Great Water and landed near the mouth of the Alabama River, and were finally driven to the heads of its waters and even to the Hiawassee River by the Mexican Indians, who had been driven out of their own country by the Spaniards. That is a very bold claim, especially since the Welsh would have referred to themselves as Cymry, but Sevier wasn't done. He continued on, writing, many years past I happened in company with a Frenchman, which is, if we're being honest, a fate worse than death, who lived with the Cherokees and had been a great explorer of the country west of the Mississippi. This Frenchman had informed him that he had been high up on the Missouri and traded several months with the Welsh tribe, that they spoke much of the Welsh dialect, and although their customs were savage and wild, yet many of them, particularly the females, were very fair and white, and frequently told him they had sprung from a white nation of people. Also stated that they had yet some small scraps of books remaining among them, but in such tattered and destructive order that nothing intelligible remained. This, admittedly, is a rather convenient hedge against anyone checking to see if the books really existed. Still, it is from this tribe, settled in a very obscure part of the Missouri, surrounded by innumerable lofty mountains, that the supposedly Welsh language book made its way back to the Cherokee. Sevier himself had not seen the book, but instead had learned of its existence from a Conestoga, who told him that an old woman in his nation by the name Peg had some part of an old book given to her by an Indian living high up the Missouri, and thought he was one of the Welsh tribe. But unfortunately, before Sevier himself could see the book, the old woman's house and its contents were consumed by fire. Sadly, though he was able to speak with a number of people who had seen the book, none could describe or recreate any of the words or characters they'd seen within, and thus it and any other trace of Madoc and his Welsh Indians were lost forever. But that doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. The most complete version of the legend of Prince Madoc can be found in David Powell's The History of Cambria, now called Wales, which he published during the Elizabethan era and claimed was an updated and corrected version of the by then a couple of decades old Chronica Waliae a Rege Cadwallader ad Annum 1294 by Humphrey Cloyds, who in turn had claimed his book to be a translation and adaptation of Caradoc of Clancarvan's much earlier Brut I Tawisogion, which itself does not cite Caradoc as the author. And if you think this is difficult to follow, wait till I make a video about the historicity of King Arthur. According to Powell's work, Madoc's story begins with the death of his father, Owain Gwynedd, in 1170 AD. Welsh inheritance laws were complicated at the time, and the fact that the king had fathered at least 15 sons with no less than 6 women and then died an excommunicant didn't make things any easier. Today, we think of royal succession in the way that the English crown does things, which is primogeniture, where the oldest living legitimate child of the reigning monarch is, unless otherwise indicated, the heir to the throne and inherits the title of King of England with all its lands. That's how things worked in England at the time, too, but in the 12th century, Wales still largely operated under the Cyfraith Howell, also known as the Laws of Howell, established by King Howell Dda in the 9th century. The relevant difference between the two systems was in the requirement that the heir be a legitimate son of the king, which was not the case in Wales. This meant that under Welsh law, Owen's eldest living son, Howell, was the strongest claimant to the throne, and thus he was crowned King of Gwynedd in 1170. The problem was that Wales was Catholic, and under Catholic custom, only a legitimate son of the king could inherit the crown. Going by that system, the crown would instead pass to Iorwerth ap Owen, the eldest legitimate son, but there was a wrinkle in that too. He was deformed, and Welsh law prohibited those with deformities, infirmities, and other disabilities from rule, so he couldn't make a claim. The claim would then fall to the next eldest legitimate son, Maelgwn, who was Iorwerth's younger brother, but he deferred to Welsh law and respected the coronation of his eldest living brother, even though he could have appealed to the church for support in claiming the throne. But the same was not true of Owen's fifth son, Davith. As far as he saw it, Howell was illegitimate and Maelgwn had denied the throne, which made him the next legitimate heir as he was not born out of wedlock. However, he also wasn't born to the same mother as Iorwerth or Maelgwn, Gwladys Ferch Llywch, I'm trying my best, guys, who it seems must have died prior to his birth. This normally wouldn't have been a problem, but for the small issue that Davith's mother, Kristen Ferch Garanwi, was Owain Gwyned's first cousin. And Catholic doctrine prohibits marriage between first cousins, so Davith, while legitimate by Welsh legal standards, was illegitimate from the Catholic perspective. So technically, he held the worst claim of the elder sons, but that didn't stop him from launching a civil war against Howell. This is the point when Madoc enters the story, according to Powell's account of events. I would love to compare his version with that of Humphrey Cloyd himself, but since the University of Wales Press apparently doesn't think Americans deserve to be able to read their books, I couldn't get a copy of it in time to make this video. Not cool, guys. Not cool. I literally couldn't ship to America. I could ship to American Samoa. I could ship to the US Virgin Islands. No United States. In any case, Powell records that Madoc, another of Owain Gwyned's sons, left the land in contention betwixt his brethren, and prepared ships with men and munition, and sought adventures by seas, sailing west, and leaving the coast of Ireland so far north that he came to a land unknown, where he saw many strange things. This, according to Welsh historian Gwyn Williams, is the extent of what is present in Humphrey Cloyd's adaptation, which suggests that Powell added the next bit, either through fabrication or an appeal to an older source I'll mention in a minute. This land must needs be some part of that country of which the Spaniards affirm themselves to be the first finders since Hanno's time. We're not going to get into the mention of Hanno the Navigator being the one who found the Americas, because that's a whole other thing. What matters is what comes immediately after that. For by reason and order of cosmography, this land to which Madoc came must needs be some part of Nova Hispania or Florida, whereupon it is manifest that the country was long before by Britons discovered. Obviously, in order for this story to have been known to the Welsh of the 1500s, Madoc must have returned, and Powell records that after he returned home and declared the pleasant and fruitful countries that he had seen without inhabitants, and upon the contrary part, for what barren and wild ground his brethren and nephews did murder one another, he prepared a number of ships, and got with him such men and women as were desirous to live in quietness, and taking leave of his friends took his journey thitherward again. Therefore it is presupposed that he and his people inhabited part of those countries. Is Shakespeare's Riz the reason that our language was the way it was? Put into simple terms, Powell's claim is that Madoc was a son of Owen Gwynedd who sailed west in search of adventure rather than choosing sides in the wars between his brothers, then landed somewhere between Mexico and Florida, explored, found nobody there, and then went back to Wales to convince people to help him start a colony to the west. All of this, he says, could be found in the work of the Welsh poet and genealogist Gwytyn Owen, who, according to the Dictionary of Welsh Biography, was noted as an authority on the pedigrees of Gwynedd and Powys and the March, though if any reference to Madoc's journey was to be found in his work, it has unfortunately been lost. Powell then goes on to suggest that the Aztecs are in fact the descendants of Madoc's colonists, based mainly on Spanish stories about the Aztecs having rulers who descended from a strange nation that came thither from a far country, and the fact that some Aztec words described by the Spanish sound similar to certain Welsh words. But since the Aztec migration story suggests coming from the north by land and not the east by water, and since the Welsh word penguin is about a rock and not a bird, I think it's safe to say that his reasoning was faulty at best. Or, more likely, his reasoning was based upon something else entirely. You see, Powell was writing in 1584 when England was preparing to make its first attempts to establish colonies in the New World, and at the time, they faced a couple of significant hurdles. First, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 saw the Pope from Assassin's Creed Brotherhood grant Spain the right to colonize all lands more than 370 leagues west of Cabo Verde, on the grounds that the Spanish got there first. The fact that the Pope stood behind that decision didn't bother the English all that much, since Pope Pius V had already excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I in 1570 for the heresy of not caring what he thought. What did bother the English was the total lack of legal authority they had to establish colonies in North America, which would make any attempt to settle a de facto act of war. The Spanish were firmly established in North America by this point, England was not the naval superpower it would be 200 years later, and English support for Spain's enemies had created a tense diplomatic situation already. If they were to colonize the New World without risking open conflict, they would need to be able to claim that they'd discovered it first, and Madoc's story could provide the justification for that claim. When war broke out between England and Spain in 1585, it wasn't because the Spanish rejected the story about Madoc. For all they knew, it could have been correct, and they may have even had reason to think that it was. While the argument that Madoc landed somewhere in what was by then Spanish North America is dubious, the story of the Welsh navigator wasn't new. In fact, it was remarkably old. Over a century before Powell published History of Cambria, Madoc appeared in the work of a Welsh poet named Madoc ap Rhys. I don't speak nearly enough Welsh to try and translate or even read the verse, but Gwyn Williams provides a translation in Madoc, The Legend of the Welsh Discovery of America, which reads as follows. Aidan, the Welsh mood lighting. Thank you. Madoc the bold, true whelp of Owen Gwynedd, would not have land nor great wealth but the seas. A Madoc am I to my age, and to his passion for the seas have I been accustomed. The reference in Mardud's work is frustratingly Welsh in its assumption that we're just going to know who Mardud is talking about, and it's not dissimilar from the first written mention of King Arthur in history. That one reads, and Aidan, the Welsh mood lighting again, but make it a couple hundred years older. I don't know how he's gonna... Anyway, I have the mood lighting. He fed black ravens on the wall of the fortress, although he was not Arthur. Among those powerful in feats, in the front rank, a palisade, Gword Arthur. But what about the rest of the claim? Mardud offers no information about where Madoc went. We're only told that he was a seafarer and in some way connected to Owen Gwynedd, though the translation Williams gives uses the term whelp and so implies that Madoc was a son. He notes in another text, in Welsh of course, that this word, kenai, in the Welsh language of the poem, can also mean a member of his retinue, a descendant, or even that Madoc is worthy of being considered as such. Now that would explain why Madoc doesn't show up in any genealogies of Owen Gwyned's family, at the very least, but it doesn't explain where the story of Madoc traveling to North America comes from. Still, it is obvious that Madoc was a well-known figure by Mardud's day. As Williams puts it, the line, "A Madoc I am to my age," is incomprehensible without the assumption that some tradition of Madoc a seafarer existed. The question is not whether Madoc's story was a real tradition, but rather where it originated. From what I can tell, the earliest reference comes from the work of a mysterious 12th century figure named Willem, who appears to have been better known for his version of the medieval satire piece Reynard the Fox. In the introduction to his Flemish language retelling of that story, the author refers to himself as Willem die Madoca Macada, or, in the most simple translation, Willem, the author of Madoc. The prologue contains a second reference, which in the English translation reads, "Willem who labored to indict Madoc in many a wakeful night." Unfortunately, we have no existing copies of Willem's Madoc, but we certainly do have references to it. One exists in a later French work, which casts it in the same category as the Romances of Arthur, but the more interesting of the French contributions to the legend comes in the form of a manuscript fragment of a French-language copy of Willem's story, allegedly found in Poitiers, France during the 17th century. Gwyn Williams acknowledges that it could have been written after Powell's work and the claims associated with it began to circulate, though he also notes that why anyone in 17th century France should go to the trouble of that kind of fabrication is beyond conjecture. A local scholar, however, he continues, believes that the fragment belongs to the late 14th century or even earlier. In this version, Madoc is not Owen's son, but is instead a Welsh nobleman from another house, whose grandfather was half a Viking. This could mean that he was a nephew of Owen, however, because Owen's father, Gruffydd ap Cynan, was the grandson of Sihtric Silkenbeard, a famous Hiberno-Norse king who lived during the 10th century. Gruffydd grew up in Norse Dublin during the mid-11th century, where he almost certainly would have heard stories of Leif Erikson's ventures to Vinland, and the overall Norse trade connections with what was at the time known as Markland, probably Labrador. If you're interested in more on that, we actually have 2 videos on it. I'll put them in the description. If Madoc, whoever he might have been, came from that lineage, then he would more than likely know about Vinland himself, as did many of the noble class of Northern Europe and even beyond. According to the alleged Willem fragment, Madoc went on a mission to the court of France disguised as a monk, had a lover who wore fishnets, hot, went sailing in search of the Fountain of Youth, landed on the Isle of Ely to find a lodestone, and had a ship with nails made of staghorn. Even back then, Aiden, they were into the goth girls.
Even back then they were based.
Based and Madoc-pilled. Sailing out from Ely, Williams summarizes, Madoc found an island paradise bathed in sun, and returned to Ely for more ships to launch a new kingdom of love and music. Man, he really was into goth girls. The poet Willem also includes bits about an island surrounded by very large fish and a treacherous garden in the sea. And Gwyn Williams is right to note the similarities to many Celtic voyaging stories from Ireland and Wales, such as the Voyage of Bran and the Voyage of St. Brendan. He also draws attention to Ely, which was an archaic name for Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel between Wales and the Cornish Peninsula, which Madoc appears to have used as a base of operations during his voyages. And that right there is very interesting, Williams argues, because a story from the Norse the Orkney Saga, contemporary to Madoc's proposed lifetime, involves a Welsh raider who attracts Sudri and Man, and then escapes to his stronghold on the Isle of Lund. It is difficult to impose much coherence on all of this, Williams says, particularly in view of the geographical scatter. On the other hand, the middle of the 12th century also saw an influx of Flemish mercenaries into Wales, and Willem, the author of Madoc, could very well have been among them. Could this freeman from Wales described in the saga be the same Welsh seafarer Willem was writing about? And if he was, is it possible that he really did leave Europe to sail for the sun-baked shores of the Gulf of Mexico? Yes, but the better question is it probable? I think we need to break the question down into 2 parts. First, what is the likelihood that a Welsh nobleman living in the 1170s would know about and possess the ability to sail to North America? And second, what is the likelihood that this individual could or would have made it all the way to the Caribbean? The answer to the first one is actually pretty straightforward. It's yes, he could have. If Madoc was who he is said to have been, then he absolutely would have had the knowledge and the resources to make a voyage similar to the one that the Norse were taking to North America. As for the latter, there's a lot more that goes into it. As far as recorded history goes, the farthest European explorers ever made it before Columbus was Newfoundland, or perhaps, if we really want to stretch, maybe the Bay of Fundy. That's a journey of about 4,000 miles, which even in the Norse-style longships Madoc would have been using, would have taken quite a while. Proceeding all the way to the Gulf of Mexico would have been another 2,000 miles, and would have meant passing beyond numerous stretches of very fertile, habitable land, which would have been much more familiar to the Welsh than anything south of Appalachia. If the Norse weren't willing to go that far, it's hard to believe that the considerably less seaworthy Welsh would have looked to go anywhere beyond the Chesapeake Bay. More importantly, Willem's story described Madoc finding an island paradise bathed in sun, and not Mobile, Alabama. Tongue-in-cheek as it is, there are quite a few places that match that description long before we get to Mexico, and even in 1559, Humphrey Cloyd wasn't suggesting that's where they'd gone. The mention of very large fish could refer to Atlantic bluefin tuna, which can reach up to 8 feet long and weigh up to 1,000 pounds, with the record currently sitting at 1,496 pounds. Alternatively, it could refer to any number of the whale species which populate the Atlantic. And while it might seem a little silly to speculate about the big fish, I actually do have a point here. Both fish and whales migrate, spending their summers in the North Atlantic before heading south to the warmer waters close to the equator for the winter. Even a Welshman would know that attempting a transatlantic voyage in the winter was a bad idea, so Madoc almost certainly would have been sailing in the late spring or early summer. If he'd gone to Mexico, all those very large fish would have been in the North Atlantic, and therefore not surrounding his island paradise. So, where would you find whales or tuna in the summer? Both would be in their feeding grounds off the coast of New England, Nova Scotia, and potentially as far north as the Gulf of St. Lawrence. If Madoc really did sail west, and he really did find an island surrounded by very large fish, then he was probably somewhere between Nantucket and Lanzo Meadows, not off the coasts of Florida. As such, it would be difficult for him to have anything to do with the legends of the Moon-Eyed People, Fort Mountain, or any other related stories. It's not that it would be impossible for them to get to Georgia, it's just that basically every other potential option is orders of magnitude more likely. Now, was there a Prince Madoc, and did he sail west to new shores? I'd like to think it's possible. There was a time when the stories of Leif Erikson, Thorfinn Karlsefni, and their voyages to Vinland were thought to potentially just be the stuff of legend. All it takes is for one person to dig in the right spot just once, and entire chapters of history could be rewritten in an instant. You know, if you'll allow me to get on my soapbox for a minute, we don't have to sit back and wonder about these things forever. I know that the more I study the prehistory of this continent, the more I see that we have gaps in our understanding. We're missing something big in North America, and it's right under our noses. Before the Cherokee faced the Moon-Eyed People, before the Iroquois formed the Five Nations, there were massive kingdoms in the heart of America. And for some reason, they all seem to have collapsed together. In South America, entire cities lie buried underneath the Amazonian canopy, visible only to LiDAR imaging. In Europe, civilizations once existed which now live on only in the gods their conquerors absorbed, and we still don't know who the Sea Peoples were. There are incredible mysteries out there to be explored, and there are thousands of unemployed or underemployed archaeologists out there to explore them. Tons of historians who would love nothing more than to dedicate their careers to reading between the lines of ancient books in search of things we've missed and truths of which we're not yet aware. They just need the funding to do it. And if there's one thing I could say to people like Jimmy Corsetti and Graham Hancock, it's that maybe you should stop focusing on lambasting, the WEF and the archaeological community and all of that. And in Hancock's case, I sort of get the antagonism, but maybe turn your attention towards guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and explain to them how the fortunes they've built could, without really, doing more than taking a drop in the bucket, reveal incredible things about history. They could attach their name to the discovery of the real Atlantis, for example. I mean, I get it, Jimmy, the grift of pretending that there's some global conspiracy to hide Göbekli Tepe makes you a lot of money, and, anytime somebody contradicts you on Twitter, you just go and block them, but maybe use the platform you've built for good for once. You, Ben Davidson, all the other nonsense grifters out there who make it so much harder for me to get people to understand reality. But since we all know that they're not going to do it, if you, the viewer, want to do your part, you can always tweet at these people. You can send them emails. You can contact them. You can say, hey, there's all these really cool things out there that we don't know about yet, and nobody has the money to find them but you. Now, that said, Thornbury actually has some ideas. He came to me and asked to present. I don't know, I haven't read what he's gonna say, so I wash my hands of this. I'm sure it's fine, but I wash my hands of this.
It's hard to relinquish the romantic idea, however improbable, that a young explorer committed to discovery, despite all the odds and setbacks, achieved his goal of landing somewhere previously unknown to the world. And as in most fun alternate history stories, the world took his tales as tall and fictitious, declaring the journey to have been too hazardous and too long. The reality, as Mattis so eloquently told it, is almost certainly that the story of Madoc is just that, a story. Or at the very least, something far less than the online conspiracies might say. But for the more imaginative among us, myself included, it's hard not to wonder, what if he did beat all the odds against him, and this story were true? Maybe it's my semi-autistic affinity for the sea, maybe it's the fact that I finally have fixed my own boat after 2 years of working on it to no avail, and I'm just in a position where I'm really excited to talk about something nautical. Who knows? I don't know the reason, but whatever it is, I think it would be fun to explore the idea of how exactly it might be possible that Madoc actually made it to the American tropics. What would it have taken to achieve this feat? Setting off from Lundy in a Viking longship as a Welshman is already a rough start. The best equivalent I can draw is like having a 12-year-old jockeying an ox in the Kentucky Derby. The Viking longships, as nimble as they were already rough vessels for crossing open ocean due to their low freeboard and straight clinker design, which just means that the wood planks on their hulls were overlapping each other rather than seamlessly connected. Not unlike that of classic rowboats or pram designs, like the chines of even a modern speedboat. The problem with this design, like all previously mentioned designs, is that in rough water they have a tendency to slam and shake as a result of the chines acting like little belly flops on the hull. Basically, when they come down on the water, they're just gonna slap. Additionally, the low freeboard of their design means that the distance from the waterline to the top of the boat was pretty short, making it so that way it doesn't take much water for it to crash over the side and start filling the boat. For skilled Viking sailors, this was manageable. For those less skilled, it would likely have been much more difficult. Another factor of the Viking longships, along with all sailing vessels at the time, for the most part at least, was their ability to direct where they wished to travel. Sailboats are limited in their ability to navigate as a result of the physics of their design. Modern sailboats have ample room to navigate, as their vertical triangular sails stretched over masts and booms allows them to make efficient airfoil shapes, giving them the ability to sail into the wind as air passes over the airfoils, creating lift which quite literally pulls the ships forward. And slightly sideways, but that's what the keel's for. But even they cannot directly sail into the wind. The best even modern sailboats can achieve is something called close hauled, which is about 30 to 45 degrees off of the direct direction of the wind. Due to these limitations, modern sailboats are legally required to have motors installed to help compensate, especially when navigating through tight waterways, like canals, rivers, anything like that. Older square rig ships were even more limited in their mobility. Due to their square sails and complex rigging, they were by and large incapable of allowing their sails to angle properly to create any even remotely efficient enough airfoil to travel into the wind. Later designs, like in the golden age of sail, had triangular sails ahead of and in between their square sails, allowing for this directional movement, very much in the airfoil style of modern sailboats. The problem is that the sail area to weight ratio of those ships meant that they were largely inefficient and slow in attempting to go upwind in any direction or length of time. Viking longships predated these additions and relied solely on a single square-rigged sail. The lack of rigging meant more freedom to maneuver the sail to airfoil angling, but the lack of a boom or effective support structure for the sail, combined with the inefficiency of the square shape, meant that upwind travel was possible, though severely limited. Most likely relinquished to that of close reach as opposed to close hauled, or beam reach was likely more common. Me in the future will be putting some form of image to help display this visually as well. I'm bringing all this up to acknowledge the fact that sailing west from the British Isles would have been an absolute bear of a task. The predominant winds in that area of the North Atlantic go directly against the sought destination of the Americas. The impressively effective navigation of the Vikings allowed them to make the most of this barrier to entry, but even then it would have required endless tacking back and forth, a tireless zigzag across the Atlantic, as if attempting to escape some Leviathan alligator. This gives further credence to Mattis's conclusion that the journey of Madoc was unlikely at best, but the romantic storyteller within me struggles to let go the possibility of what if. Suppose Madoc took a page out of the Viking playbook and remained steadfast, keeping his crew motivated in line to a degree that would make Jack Aubrey shed a tear. What would it take? Well, it would take a lot of suffering and endless determination. But in the 1100s, for a man aiming to make a name for himself, that was kind of the expectation. To get to the Americas, it would take weeks, more like months, especially if the winds remained against his favor. If not entirely off course of land, though he wouldn't know exactly where he was going from the start, his first likely destination would be that either of Canada or New England. Assuming he left in spring, this would put him right in the summer feeding grounds of various highly migratory species and whales, as previously mentioned. But what if Madoc, the Welshman he was, wasn't the navigator he'd hoped to be? What if, as with the Roanoke colony, wind, tide, and weather were not in his favor? What if a man, dead set on finding land, was forced by Mother Nature to endure a journey longer than ever anticipated? What if the western and southwestern winds of the trade winds, combined with the western winds influenced by the jet stream over the North Atlantic, and the persistent changes of the North Atlantic Oscillation, created the perfect storm of events to prevent landfall in the North Atlantic, forcing Madoc and his team to either turn back or keep going until the winds eased up enough to let them turn ashore? Or, even simpler, what if Madoc just simply followed the guide of the wind? As Madoc made headway across the Atlantic following the guide of the Eric the Red journey, whether knowingly or not, sailing directly into that wind, what if he maintained that course, even as the wind changed apparent direction, believing the wind fighting against him was emerging from the land he was seeking? He could have been as close to 10 miles from shore at any given point and never even known it, with no major structures in existence at that point in time to give alert of the land beyond the horizon. Both of these possibilities would have led Madoc and his team south, as opposed to directly west, over weeks and months, guiding them down the Atlantic coast as the migratory species flooded back to their winter waters to escape the cooling autumnal north. Traveling along the continental shelf of North America, sustaining themselves on fish and rain, not unlike the mutinies of HMS Bounty centuries later, who made their way to safety by a 3,500 nautical mile journey across the South Pacific in a single-masted lifeboat. The Welshmen following this rift until hitting the first land in line, the Bahamas. A vast array of island gardens where fish like tuna, marlin, swordfish, grouper, and the like frequent, and where tropical flora and fauna abound. If we were to be slightly more skeptical, maybe upon entering the subtropics, the wind finally gave way, and he found refuge among the shores of one of the Carolinian islands, themselves covered with palm trees and shores filled with game fish. This would have required ample navigation to avoid the treacherous, ever-changing sandbars and reefs that many ships have struck and sunk upon throughout history. But the slim draft, which is the depth of the hull from the waterline to the bottom of the boat, on a Viking-style longboat may have helped in this event. Now, as a reminder, as Mattis's earlier presentation suggests, this is all extremely unlikely. Unlikely further is the possibility that Madoc and his crew entirely missed the Bahamas and wound up in the Gulf of Mexico somehow. Also, yeah, I'm sorry, but force of habit, I call it Gulf of Mexico. It's not a political thing, it's what I grew up with. Trying to change it now is, old dogs don't learn new tricks. Anyway, moving on. Point being, getting into the Gulf and avoiding almost every other landmass on the way to then land at some place which would then become Mobile, Alabama, is it impossible? No, but even more unlikely than a misadventure across the sea to the Bahamas and back. The only way I could see them arriving somewhere near where Mobile would have ended up being is if, after attempting to zigzag across the North Atlantic through the westerly winds, they decided to bail and headed south, following the wind as it swirled their little ship down the western coast of Europe and Africa, and then slingshotting it east, across the tropics, through the line of islands north of Brazil, and up just south of Jamaica and the Caymans, through the Yucatan Channel, between Cancun, Mexico, and Cuba, and then up into the Gulf straight into the area of current-day Mobile. Now, the amount of land that they would have had to miss, ignore, or continue on from is staggering, and the chances for alternate landfalls even greater. Most importantly, these trade winds would not be discovered until Columbus, centuries later, who discovered their usefulness in his attempt to find a path to India westward by leaving southward. This would require a complete disbelief or disregard of such a journey to the point where the telling was altered, never mentioning the turn south in the foretold accounts, and a complete lack of curiosity of anybody capable of attempting the journey for centuries to come. As Mattis's conclusion should have rightfully persuaded you, the overwhelming probability is that the majority of Madoc's journey was, at best, a modern exaggeration of a medieval tale that may or may not have happened. However, we live in a world where the improbable remains possible, and unanswered questions leave open the opportunity for conspiracies to abound. We here at the Lore Lodge often find ourselves raging against the tides of fact, truth, and tale to find the reality that lays underneath the claims. Sometimes, the mystical is left unmasked as mere coincidence, as we've seen with many of the missing 411 stories. And at other times, the monotonous gives way to the monstrous, as in the many failures of the judicial system throughout the case of John Benet Ramsey, which we are in fact still working on. But among it all, it's important to separate out the story from the reality. And sometimes you need to hear the story to understand why it's most likely just that, a story.
If you like the story and you'd like to see more like this one, as well as more paranormal, folklore, and other such topics, Let us know by commenting your requests for videos. The more descriptive you can be, the better, and if you can provide us source names, I'll be able to give everything a look. The great tragedy of this job is that we are still bound by the almighty algorithm, so if you'd like to help us get to the point where we can just kind of ignore it without going bankrupt, you can support us directly by subscribing on Patreon. It's just $1 a month, and the more of you we have over there, the more help we can hire, the more we'll be able to branch out on subject matter, and the more time I can put into making the content you guys really love, and not just the stuff YouTube wants us to produce. You can also check out our merch at Bunker Branding, or get our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, through Tableau Roasting Company. Both are linked in the description, as our Patreon and our Discord server, which is the best place to get updates on new videos, projects, and our live shows, which run Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern unless they don't, and if they don't, we'll tell you. You can also catch recordings of the lives here on YouTube and on all podcast platforms the Wednesday after the show, and don't forget to check out our other channels like The Weird Bible, History Unhinged, and my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where if you're watching this before 6 p.m. on the day it came out, I will be streaming tonight. I dropped the mouse. I dropped the mouse on the floor. Last but not least, I'd like to thank The Book for sponsoring this video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lord.